Afternoon, and welcome to the first of this term's virtual retro seminars. My name's Alan Morrison. I'm Professor of Law and Finance at the Saïd Business School, and I'm joined today by Rita Mota, who is the Intesa Sanpaolo Research Fellow at the Saïd Business School, who co-convenes these seminars with me, and by our speaker, Sarah Glozer. Sarah is Associate Professor in Marketing, Business and Society at the University of Bath School of Management, where she's also Deputy Director at the Centre of Business Organisations and Society. Her research is concerned with CSR communications, ethical consumer behaviour and social media, and she's particularly interested in the ways in which businesses and consumers negotiate their understanding of CSR and sustainability. As a former global sustainability manager at Cadbury, she brings practical as well as intellectual expertise to her work. I'll turn the floor over to Sarah in a moment, but before I do so, I'm going to make a few quick remarks about the seminar. Today's seminar is generously supported by the Centre for Corporate Reputation, which is an interdisciplinary research centre here at the Business School in Oxford that is directed by Rupert Younger. Within Oxford, the centre is currently home to 6 postdoctoral researchers and 2 doctoral students, where there's focal point for a network of around 40 senior academic international research fellows and about 50 very senior visiting fellows from the world of business, policy and politics. Retro, that is Reputation, Ethics, Trust and Relationships at Oxford, is a seminar series that's concerned with the ethical and normative content of trust and reputation in organisational life. It's one of a wide range of seminars and conferences that occurs through the Centre for Corporate Reputation. Many of those activities were interrupted by the current pandemic, so we're really happy that we're able to run this seminar series online. The online talks have proved to be intellectually exciting as our in-person seminar series, and as an added benefit, we're able to reach a wide audience and to make new friends from all over the world. But making this happen is hard work, so I'd like to thank the people who've contributed to this effort. Thank you to Rupert Younger, Director of the CCR, and also thank you to Sarah Livingston, Chris Page, and Mark Hughes Morgan. And I'm particularly grateful to Rita, whose energy, ideas, and expertise are the real motive forces behind these seminars. Okay, to the seminar. Almost everybody knows that it's almost exactly 50 years since the publication of Milton Friedman's classic New York Times editorial about the social role of business. Perhaps fewer people are aware that it's almost exactly 50 years since the British newspaper The Sun started every day to publish pictures of topless women on page 3 of the newspaper. But the latter observation is almost as important in some ways as the former. Page 3 reflected social attitudes that were eventually called out by the Me Too movement. That movement disrupted the business and social worlds, and it had a profound effect upon trust and reputation and upon the relationships we have to one another and to the organisations and institutions that constitute our social structure. Sarah's work speaks directly to those effects. She generates insights into the institutional work done by feminist actors in opposition to page 3. People working to dismantle entrenched and institutional sexism experience high levels of abuse and harassment. And Sarah asks how those people maintain their emotional energy in the face of that abuse. Her work's timely, and it addresses questions that sit at the heart of the Centre for Corporate Reputation's mission. Because there are so many people coming to this seminar, we have to be slightly formal about the format. If you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A box that appears somewhere on your Zoom screen, probably at the bottom, and not into the chat. Either Rita or I will relay them to Sarah. Sarah's going to speak for 20 to 30 minutes, during which time she'll respond to clarification questions only. After that, I hope we can have a reasonably wide-ranging discussion. We're going to finish very promptly at 5 o'clock. Sarah, thank you for being with us today, and over to you.
Well, Alan, Rita, and the team, thank you so much for such a warm welcome. I'm now going to share my screen and launch my slides. So I'm hoping that you can now see my slides. I'm going to be talking through today a paper that is currently in the final round, hopefully, of reviews at Organisation Studies. And it's a paper that I'm co-authoring with my fantastic co-author, Dr. Laura McCarthy at Royal Holloway University of London. This paper is one that we're very passionate about, so we're delighted to have the opportunity to share the findings of our study today with the Retro seminar series. And I think that Alan has provided a really nice overview of essentially the rationale for this paper. So we're very much interested in the replenishment of emotional energy in the context of social media activism, and predominantly feminist activism activated through social media in relation to disruptive institutional change. So without further ado, I'm going to click through my slides. So to give a little bit of a background around my interests, my focus is actually as a responsible business scholar, and I am interested in the business and society kind of nexus, predominantly in the context of communication. So my research to date has looked at how organizations communicate responsibly, as well as how organizations communicate about responsibility. And I'm interested in this in a predominantly digital context, and this has led me into examining digital dialogue. So essentially the creation of meaning between two or more parties. And in order to look at dialogue, I've examined the dialogical context of social media, and particularly organization and stakeholder communications in platforms such as Facebook. And one of my recent publications has tried to really encapsulate this idea of social media as almost a never-ending dialogue, which is fueled by continual and productive dissent. But there was one particular strategy that struck me as I was spending time immersed for the purposes of research in Facebook, organizational Facebook pages. There was this one particular strategy from an activist group that really caught my attention. This was the strategy of the No More Page 3 actors. So for those of you not familiar with No More Page 3, it was an organization that was established around about 2012, predominantly through an e-petition. And the focus of No More Page 3 was to basically lobby the Sun newspaper, and indeed companies that advertise with the Sun, and indeed stockists of the Sun, around removing page 3. So for those of you not familiar, a sexualized, essentially nude image of a woman on a daily image on page 3 of the newspaper. Now, what was really important was that the actors here, the feminist actors, were not against nudity per se, but they were against the context of sexualization. So page 3 was actually representative of institutionalized sexism. And so this organization came together with this core premise in mind, to challenge page 3 and therefore challenge institutionalized norms in society, which leads to gender objectification. Now, what was it that they did that excited me so much? Well, I was really startled by the level of kind of misogynistic, abusive, really quite personal posts that were levied against the actors of this movement. So in their work to try and disrupt the page 3 institution, they were met with a huge amount of abuse and harassment, death threats, rape threats, some of the most unbelievable kind of forms of trolling I've ever seen. And what they did in response was really interesting, because their posts were really rational, they were really reasoned, they were factual. And it really struck me that these individuals were responding in through their personal accounts in a way that was really well organized. So it was at this point that I started speaking with my co-author Lauren McCarthy, who's an expert in looking at responsible business issues through a feminist lens and thinking about these questions in terms of kind of gender and institutions. So what you see here are pictures of the kind of physical protest, but actually a huge amount of energy was dedicated online. So what happened was, and a certain individual, the individual you see here on the screen, Lucy Ann Holmes, a journalist, was the individual who started this organisation. And it began just with her, and then a group of a kind of small, close-knit community called the headquarters of individuals who kind of had this like-minded vision to kind of combat page 3. And soon this core group of individuals developed a following in the thousands. But what Lucy Ann Holmes really took issue with was that in 2012, which was the year of the Olympics here in the UK, and the year that Jessica Ennis-Hill won gold, Lucy Ann Holmes found herself flicking through the Sun newspaper, so one of the most circulated tabloid newspapers here in the UK. And the image of Jessica Ennis-Hill was actually really small in comparison to this huge image of the page 3 girl topless. And Lucy Ann Holmes found that as she looked through, she saw women as bodies, you know, comments about what women were wearing and if they had put weight on. And in comparison, men were presented as people who were doing things in suits and having important jobs. And so it was here that the motivation kind of came to put together this movement. And what we see here in the quote I provide, this is a quote from a journalist who interviewed Lucy Ann Holmes just a year into the movement at the start of No More Page 3. And what this quote brings to life is the fact that there were real emotional highs and emotional lows through being involved in this movement. There was passion, there was belief, there was a sense of purpose, but there was also burnout. There was also constant trolling and death threats and these misogynistic messages that these feminist actors had to kind of deal with in their online institutional work efforts. So what this quote really characterizes for us is the stress and the passion, the kind of double-edged emotional sword, if you will, of feminist institutional work. But crucially, it's also a story of survival because they never gave up. And it's for this reason that Lauren and I really pondered this question. So within these cycles of gut-wrenching lows and palpitating highs, what was it that kept Lucy Ann Holmes and those within the No More Page 3 movement going? So what I'm going to talk through today is the background context. So just to give a bit more of a story around No More Page 3. I'll then come on to our theoretical framing, our research methods, our qualitative interpretive research methods. I'll elaborate on our findings, our contributions, and in true retro seminar series style, I'll pose some questions for stimulating some dialogue. As I mentioned, this paper is still somewhat a work in progress, so we welcome your comments. Now, here is a bit of a background. So page 3, as Alan already has indicated, launched in 1970. And the purpose of page 3 was actually to launch sales, and it was a success. Page 3 did see an increase in sales. So it has often been heralded as a British institution, that good old topless woman on page 3, which is really interesting because actually there are equivalent page 3s. There is a page 9 in Denmark, a page 5 in Romania, a page 1 in Germany. These kinds of pages are not distinct to the UK context. But what we have seen is that the symbolic nature of pages such as page 3 is rather enduring. And from 1980 onwards, physical protests and campaigns started to really unfold. And the core purpose of them, as the photos I showed at the beginning of the slides highlighted, these people came together to try and put forward a new form of legislation to try and ban these sexually suggestive images in newspapers. And these evolved from kind of the legislative context to targeting the corporation. So this was kind of our interest in coming into this, thinking about how the Sun could be lobbied to remove page 3, targeting the advertisers who advertise within the Sun and indeed the Sun outlet. So it's kind of a corporate message. But unfortunately, all these efforts really failed to gain ground. Now, this was until 2012, which was when Lucy Ann Holmes started the campaign. And just again to recap, this isn't about campaigning against nudity. It was about campaigning around the context of a nude woman in one of the UK's most distributed newspapers. So in line with what has been termed fourth wave feminism, here we saw the No More Page 3 campaign launched through hashtag activism. So using the hashtag to create posts, to share posts, to target individuals, corporations around raising the context and the kind of negative societal implications of Page 3. And this did lead to some small wins. So the e-petition was signed in the thousands. The movements of individuals who were using the hashtag No More Page 3 really gathered pace. And indeed, some organizations such as Lego stopped advertising with the Sun. And in 2015 came perhaps the biggest win of all, when the Sun actually removed Page 3. So it was heralded as a success, a feminist success story Page 3 had got. But then 3 days later, it was back, owing to what the Sun described as a mammary lapse. Now, today, Page 3 is still there in some shape or form, often a woman in lingerie. But the campaign has often been lauded as a success for feminism because the traditional Page 3 topless girl no longer resides herself on Page 3 of the Sun newspaper. And in 2016, the No More Page 3 movement, an organization, disbanded and reformed a broader campaign group around Not the Sexist News. So our particular research context is stemming from round about 2012. Our data starts 2012, so when the campaign came into fruition. And we actually collected data over a 6-year period. So we reflected on some of the post-movement activity. Now, in terms of our theoretical framing, we felt very quickly that there was an emotional story here. So the No More Page 3 actors were equally victimized and villainized in the press. There was a real kind of love-hate relationship for them, which stemmed throughout the press and indeed into the social media climates within which they were operating. And this emotive story led Lauren and I to look into the literature around institutional work in a kind of emotional context, the emotion work literature. And predominantly, we were interested in this idea of emotional energy. So we're premised upon a very sociological and relational view of emotions. And the idea that emotions are a part of everyday life, and our experiences of those emotions, and indeed how we express those emotions, is often conditioned by the norms within which we live in. And so we build upon papers and a great amount of research that has been evolving over the last couple of years around the strategic use of emotion to generate emotional energy needed for institutional work. So in creating, maintaining disruptive institutions and disrupting institutions, often there is a need to draw on something to sustain activism. It's often emotion. But we focus upon this idea of an emotional energy. So emotional energy is a term that is well utilized in this literature, but often rarely defined. And we built upon Collins' work, so kind of research around social movement environs, and around this idea of collective effervescence. So when individuals come together, this kind of positive energy that is created, this excitement, this form of electricity, this passion. And this was kind of our premise for the paper, understanding emotional energy that mobilizes and gravitates individuals together to work towards a collective goal. So in our context, disrupting institutionalized sexism. We are not thinking about emotions as a binary, so kind of positive and versus negative emotions, because recent literature has actually elaborated on how negative emotions can, of course, have positive outcomes. So it might be that feelings of pain, for instance, actually fuel positive and productive institutional work efforts. So we were interested in this idea of almost like a battery. Emotions is almost a battery of kind of a charge that fuels activity and mobilizes solidarity around hashtag activism, or around the kind of No More Page 3 actors who were all based in locations around the world, but mobilized online together through this particular hashtag. So we saw that these online participatory communities had been created within which emotional energy flourishes. But what we saw within the literature was that we were still missing some key insights into what happens when emotional energy flounders? What happens in the face of adversity? And believe me, these actors, as I'd noted at the beginning, were really faced with a huge amount of personal misogynistic, as a lot of the time women, feminist actors were met with a huge amount of abuse and harassment. So what was it that kept them going? And ultimately, in the face of this network misogyny, what fuels and defines and almost refuels emotional energy became the gap that Lauren and I were most interested in trying to understand. And this was building upon a special issue of Organisation Studies that was published in 2018. So our second theoretical framing was around the gender institution, and we can actually argue that gender is an institution. It is symbolic of a set of, albeit contentious, societal ideals, beliefs, and actions around the representation or role of women in society. So women's bodies, and bodies really became quite a core part of our findings, and indeed our thinking about the paper, because women's bodies are policed in a way that perhaps the image to the right of the screen here indicates. So we were interested in understanding how page 3 is representative of the gender institutions. It's a symbol of kind of gender objectification in society. This is not a static belief, not a static kind of understanding, but a socially constructed understanding. And this is why page 3 is arguably so archaic, right? Because it's a British institution that was launched in 1970, and indeed are societal representations in 1970 the same as societal representations today? Arguably, we could suggest that actually perhaps page 3 has always been problematic, but for the purposes of our understanding of institutions as socially constructed, we can see that the idea of gender as an institution has evolved over time. So we saw a gap in understanding around gender and emotions that goes beyond looking at differences between men and women. So a lot of the emotion work literature, institutional work literature that had focused around gender had looked at differences between men and women. But what we were thinking about here was actually a context of embedded action. So a context within which these feminist actors were in an institution that they could not escape. So we have looked at literature that has looked at, for example, context of haute cuisine, a kind of restaurant context, so individuals who work together have for instance, a shared feeling of emotion, or perhaps there are animal rights or climate change activists that use strategies around painful emotions to fuel their work. But what we had never really seen was context of embedded action. So where gender as an institution was impacting upon individuals in a way that fueled their kind of institutional work effort. So this tie between gender and institution and the individual's work. And so it was this kind of puzzle, this puzzle that we set to try to understand this nexus between what we've termed the heart, body, and the mind, and how can we understand this institutional substance that drives these feminist actors to work. So this was our research question: what refuels the emotional energy of actors performing disruptive institutional work, and indeed how does this occur? So our data set spanned, as I mentioned, across a number of years. So we began collecting data around 2012 and we finished around about 2018 when we reached theoretical saturation. And we engaged in 3 types of data collection. So we had semi-structured interviews with 6 feminist activists. Some of these feminist activists were within the core HQ that Lucy-Anne Holmes created. Some of them were kind of broader activists that were just responding and getting involved in the movement. We interviewed them twice, so once in 2016 and again in 2018. And this was in order to kind of offer the opportunity for reflection. We also engaged, given that this was the context of page 3 is within a newspaper. We looked at newspaper articles. We gathered data from the normal page 3 website that was created, the e-petition, as well as you can see on here on the screen, Lucy-Anne Holmes' autobiography. And we were also interested in the live context, a real-time interaction. And crucially, we actually ended up interviewing some of the individuals who we were observing within the Facebook and Twitter pages. So those who were galvanized around the No More Page 3 activists. movement were part of our findings. And we would often gather data related to key threads. For example, when the page 3 was taken down, we gathered lots of exciting commentary that was happening around that time. And our analysis was very much inductive, focused on narratives, in order to reveal the kind of messiness of the inner worlds of these individuals. We identified common themes, characters, and plot lines. So what I'll share with you now is essentially what we found. And really the body and the emotional response to the body became a key focus of our findings. So we have a storyline here of heart, body, and mind. And really, we found that how individuals feel and act was often tied to their experiences of the gender institution. And we came up with this term of affective embodiment, which describes really how actors embody an institution and how the body and how the institution embodies them. And really, it was this kind of corporeal and emotional experience of the institution, which we found was the what, the kind of substance that helped to refuel emotional energy, this kind of shared experience, if you will. And here we draw upon the feminist literature to try and really help our understanding of this context around not just experience of the institution, but the emotional response to the institution, which bound these actors in a way that meant, because they couldn't escape the institution, almost this helped to sustain their activism and to kind of keep them going. Page 3 often reminded them of these personal experiences of the institution. So when they were faced with misogynistic posts, it only helped to kind of enhance their relationship with these kind of past, often quite painful emotions. So these personal everyday experiences of the institution, which were kind of lived and, in terms of the kind of emotions and cognitive and embodied corporeal experiences, were personal experiences that were shared collectively. Now, what I wanted to just do is highlight a few quotes, so a few elements of raw data as I talk through my findings, because I think it's quite helpful. So this is a quote that we took from the No More Page 3 website, which highlights this idea of individuals sharing and supporting and caring for one another through the movement. So this particular post is highlighting terrible things that have happened. Individuals are talking about the normalization of sexual objectification and their experiences of their own body that is perhaps shaped by the gender institution, and indeed what symbolic artifacts such as page 3 represent to them. So self-esteem was impacted through growing up with these kinds of images around. So the campaign actually helped to fuel individuals around continuing. So the shared sense of experience helped to kind of fuel individuals. These women are kind of living in these societally prescribed norms, which can't necessarily be escaped, but they can be resisted. But what we found that was really interesting was, while there was a sense of shared experience to some extent, the way that the kind of emotional response was not always a uniform one. So when actors felt depleted through institutional change efforts, their emotional experience were often mediated in terms of how they then replenish their energy. So when the going got tough and they faced adversity, yes, they had these kind of collective experiences through the body, but there were different ways in which they could understand these experiences. So some actors actually aligned with their bodily experiences. So they really drew on these shared experiences, and often, in the face of extra communal trolling, which was really targeting women's bodies, they kind of moved towards this sense of alignment. But others felt more of a misalignment. So even within the group of actors who had this shared sense of purpose, there was a sense of difference. And we saw intracommunal differences highlighted through infighting. So this wasn't necessarily a very harmonious organization. There was agitation that was happening within the organization. And it was this misalignment that drove actors to therefore replenish their emotional energy in different ways. So to highlight two quotes here from the same respondent, on the one hand, Sally argue that, the feminist stuff really lights me up. It's personal, it's maternal. It's all about, my experiences, my shared experiences that we all talk about. I'm angry and I'm passionate because this is personal to me and the people that I love. So a real kind of sense of alignment. We're in this together. But then on the other extreme, there was instances where almost infighting within the movement, or differences in opinion about the nature of the body would kind of come to light. So there were disagreements, for instance, on transgender issues. There were particular respondents we spoke to who, for cultural reasons, represented themselves and indeed their bodily experience in various ways, depending upon who was looking. So in which particular social media account, for instance, they were communicating. And there was almost this kind of creation of fear because there wasn't always an aligned vision of the body or the bodily experience. There was heterogeneity in experiences. And so this led us to understand emotional energy as being replenished in different ways. So on the one hand, we saw strength in numbers. So when individuals were feeling like they needed some kind of activation, this sense of collective effervescence and electricity, we developed this storyline of strength in numbers. And this really draws upon the concept of affective solidarity from the social movements literature, which is not new, but really highlights this idea of a movement towards the collective. So thinking about this idea of kind of a shared purpose and bringing people together to try and really galvanize the support, either through the HQ, so this small group of individuals, or also just through the hashtag. And what we found was that while there was this collective group effort, this was often activated on a more individual basis. So for instance, individuals who were in a particularly problematic thread, or were feeling overwhelmed with the amount of criticism they were facing, or perhaps they needed to go and cook the tea for, cook some tea, or perhaps they needed to go for a walk, or, needed to do some work. There was a huge amount of support there. So individuals essentially could almost pass on the baton, if you would, to someone else and tag someone else in who could continue the thread on their behalf if they were feeling depleted. So whilst there was certainly a collective context, it was often activated on a more individualized basis. So we term this affective solidarity. And this really highlights the idea of the online safe space, which was described to be really reassuring, because you could know that if you were dealing with a certain level of abuse, and if people were commenting on your appearance, again, that kind of bodily experience, and were saying terrible things around your children, you could kind of click on something and there was always someone there to drop in, help you out, and you could just drop out of the conversation, so you felt very supported. On the other hand, if people were feeling different, and often they would turn to the movement to provide some replenishment, and if that didn't provide, individuals would then move towards what we've termed a restorative retreat. So they would actually actively seek solitude, and this was represented by a movement away from the collective. And we were really captivated by this idea of retreat, not as just a place that you go to when you are feeling depleted, but also that movement of retreat, of stepping back, because we saw here the individuals in the campaign activating what we've termed a kind of sense of protective agency. And this was important, not just in sustaining the campaign, but in terms of sustaining the self. And this kind of individualized care work was really, really important because it was temporary. We saw the individuals stepping away to heal, to take time, to reflect, and then come back emboldened. So quotes here would relate to, I need to go and stare at the sky. It's too 24/7, it's too encompassing. I had to close my Facebook account. I need to pause, step back to heal. And these kinds of reflections, is a lovely quote here from Rachel in one of the Facebook pages. You should absolutely take a break, speaking to one of the other feminist actors. I think, to be honest, we could all do with one. Standing up for what is right is enough to make your legs go weak, your voice grow hoarse, and your hands to shake with rage. So a real bodily experience to these emotions that relate to experiences of not just page 3, but associated individualized, institutionalized sexism. And this was often activated through silence as well. So we would see individuals just dropping off of threads. And indeed, also individuals who would just take a whole step back from the internet, from social media for a day, a week, a month. Indeed, Lucy-Anne Holmes very nearly burnt out, and it was only through being able to take a step back that she was able to come back in. So just to recap on some of the key terms, or indeed the concepts that we are trying to introduce through this paper. The first is effective embodiment, which is essentially kind of the corporeal, so these embodied emotional responses to the experiences or the substance of the institution. So we're here talking about the institution under attack, the gendered institution, of which page 3 is a symbol. An effective embodiment leads to the refueling of emotional energy in terms of mediating how actors replenish. And we saw alignment with others' embodied experiences when we saw similarity in experience. And when faced with online abuse, meant that emotional energy was replenished through effective solidarity, so a movement towards the collective. So when you're feeling depleted with trying to challenge institutionalized gender norms, you move to the collective. But when misalignment occurred, so when perhaps there was slight differences of opinion within the group, and indeed with embodied experience, actors often then sought replenishment through restorative retreat, so an actual active movement and purposive and agentic movement away from the collective. This wasn't about admitting defeat, this was about taking time to heal and to come back to continue the fight. So that provides a bit of a background to our findings. And in terms of just what the contributions we want to make with this paper are designed to kind of elucidate, I just wanted to kind of clarify two elements of our kind of focus. So we are keen to really elaborate this what. So going back to that call in the special issue in organisation studies around what fuels, what defines emotional energy, we find that in trying to disrupt the gender institution, institutional actors draw on their own bodily experiences and emotions that are central to their oppression. So they're drawing these painful experiences, and these are the substance that therefore fuels the work. What keeps them going? This kind of understanding of central of oppression and perhaps gendered objectification, which is symbolized through page 3. So what we see is that emotional energy really relies on the bind of the body, but there is a caveat here in that there is no one body. There are lots of different bodies here and therefore different kinds of experiences. So while the body is a really important connection in terms of understanding this heart, body, mind nexus, we definitely saw heterogeneity and indeed exclusion and difference in our findings. And so we contribute to recent studies that have explored the challenges of disruptive institutions within which actors are deeply embedded. So some of those tensions when individuals cannot escape the institution. So this isn't so much about aligning with an institution due to professional identity or perhaps kind of psychographic belief or values. This is more around an institution within which individuals cannot escape, and therefore this process of challenging norms around that institution is much more painful and much more ongoing and sustained because purely the individuals cannot escape it. So we recenter the role of body within theory, so we offer a somewhat more kind of material take on emotion work literature in context of institutional change, responding to what has been called institutional substance. So that's our first contribution. Our second contribution is around the process, the how, and this is where we highlight this this nature of what we've termed emotional energy replenishment. So effective embodiment helps to explain how and why individuals perhaps either seek solidarity through the collective or they seek replenishment through a more individualized form of self-care. And this is, this kind of second finding is really important for us because we see a very kind of caring environ here, this kind of emotional care work which is going on behind the scenes around organizations such as No More Page 3. Because whilst understanding effective solidarity is not new, Indeed, solidarity and the collective are crucial to institutional change efforts. So is individualized retreat. So is stepping away to a safe place outside of what is often a very volatile, misogynistic place for many feminist actors. So we found that this idea of kind of restorative retreat is so important because individuals cannot escape the institution, and because you are in effect lobbying through your personal accounts. Often the critique is very much kind of on individual personal bodies, and this can be a very painful act. So these individuals need to find ways of reconnecting with the self outside of the social media environment in order to recharge and continue. And so we thought this was a really nice contribution in terms of providing a window behind the silence. So silence in terms of stepping away from online spaces doesn't mean that these actors are admitting defeat. It means that they are perhaps retooling, healing to come back to continue the fight, and a fight which is ongoing because they are within this institution. So yep, solidarity and collective are crucial, but indeed so is retreat. And what is important is that the way we describe restorative retreat is that it's a temporary cessation of activities. But indeed, often we saw in our data when the kind of vitriol and the harassment and abuse got too much for individuals, retreat could actually become permanent. So individuals who stepped out of social media, we had one particular respondent that stepped out of social media and indeed feminist activism in its entirety as a result. So in that sense, the retreat becomes quite permanent. So that hopefully gives you a nice overview of a topic that both Lauren and I are extremely passionate about. And in the spirit of creating dialogue, which was my interest in coming into this paper, I wanted to just come full circle to where we started today's session to provide some stimulation and thoughts for discussion for the rest of today's session. So indeed, a question that Lauren and I have posed when we think about perhaps future research directions is, to what extent is affective embodiment unique to the gender institution? So there are different institutions within which affective embodiment could be related. Let's think about here, say, alongside gender, race, ethnicity, disability, sexuality. These are all different kinds of institutions operating in society within which we are embedded in, and may provide emotional experiences upon which we activate to try and disrupt, kind of disrupt key norms. The second question is, how can we better theorize exits, silences, and agentic retreats in terms of choice? So thinking here about the kind of all-encompassing nature of a lot of this activity. What can we understand about silence? What might be the longer term implications of the emotional energy roller coaster? So again, we kind of advocate longitudinal insight here. As well as thinking about how my online or offline organizing spaces better support actors who are seeking institutional change. So this might be in terms of climate change, Extinction Rebellion, for instance, or the Black Lives Matter movement. So we are interested in discussing these questions, and hopefully there has been some food for thought there. I'd like to thank everybody for your time in listening to my session, and I will now stop sharing my screen and hand over to Rita and Alan.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for a really fascinating, deep paper. There's a great deal of food for thought there. I'm going to give people a minute or two to start putting questions into the Q&A box. And while they're doing so, I'm going to raise one question that occurred to me as I read your paper, which means I have a slight advantage over people who haven't got to read it. This notion of effective embodiment is very interesting. The idea that there's some sort of corporal emotional connection to the institution that gives us a sense of emotional effervescence. But I wondered whether it's always a source of solidarity. So at one point in the paper, you make a remark about the sometimes very white feminist experience of the collective. And I wonder if emotional embodiment is a way of reinforcing that and may actually sometimes be exclusionary. Is that possible?
Absolutely. And I think that it's a really valid observation, because initially we were under the impression that the individuals within this organization were activated around a core kind of sense of shared purpose, and therefore all had like-minded experiences. But you're absolutely right. Oftentimes we saw that there was difference, and there was perhaps exclusion, and there were very heated debates within which individuals who were part of the campaign would disagree. And this was what led us to try to understand this better, and what led us to Sarah Ahmed's work, which really tries to kind of elucidate this understanding of alignment, so where kind of bodily experience is shared, and also misalignment. So what happens, when perhaps experiences are different, and this could be through, exactly as you've mentioned, perhaps as a kind of very white view. We saw, different cultures, for instance, through some of our respondents responding to upon this in different ways. So there was not a sense of the body, but indeed a sense of various bodies, which created oftentimes tension, which added an extra level of complexity to our findings.
Great. Rita.
Thank you, Sarah, for the fascinating presentation. And like Alan, I will just take advantage of the fact that I'm here to ask you one question of my own. I'm pretty fascinated by this idea of restorative retreat. I think it's so important. And now that so much of our lives have essentially moved online, and so much activism is taking place online, much more so than in person, I think it's really important that we talk about these things. I do have a question about what really happens in one situation and the other. So in the case of affective solidarity and restorative retreat. And you characterize affective solidarity as movement towards the collective, and restorative retreat as movement away from the collective. And I don't know if I understood it correctly, but those two scenarios sounded a bit different. So affective solidarity sounded more homogeneous, for lack of a better word, and restorative retreat less so. I guess affective solidarity seemed to arise almost exclusively as a result of identification and proximity with the activist group. And restorative retreat, on the other hand, arose, I think, if I understood correctly, both as a result of in-group conflict and which I assume would weaken identification and proximity with the group, and also as a result of the incessant trolling and conflict with opponents, which I assume could also strengthen identification and proximity with the activist group, but might generate a need to step back from interactions with these outsiders from time to time. So I guess my question is, do you think that there should be some sort of theoretical distinction between these two situations? So misalignment with other group members, embodied experience, versus misalignment with outsiders, embodied experiences, which could, at least in other contexts, have quite different implications.
It's a really interesting observation. Thank you, Rita. And you're absolutely right. There was, when you're developing a kind of argument in relation to these kind of evolving, quite messy processes, there was never kind of a linear, format. There was lots of difference that kind of came about. And you're absolutely right. When individuals felt a sense of needing to reconnect with the group, that this is where affective solidarity worked. And indeed, this is a well-established term. But there was also times when that group failed to provide, and that was when these individuals then went towards retreat. But equally, these individuals could retreat just from kind of the trolling. So what we have tried to do is to kind of bring out this idea that when there was an alignment around a sense of shared experience, individuals were more likely to perhaps seek solidarity. But in circumstances where that sense of solidarity was perhaps weakened, it was in those circumstances that individuals were more likely to move towards retreat. So it is a slight nuance, but it helped us to understand the benefits of restorative retreat as kind of agentic and purposive, and not in terms of kind of holding up their hands to defeat, but how they engaged in protection of the self. So very, very much an individualistic form of care. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but what I'm trying to do is to highlight that we didn't necessarily see them on a par, but more that there was a process that individuals moved through in relation to each of those two constructs.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, we have a few questions in the Q&A. I'm going to take two of them together, and then Rita may address one of the others. We have a question from, the reason I'm taking two of them together is to make sure we get through as many as we can. We have two questions, one of which relates to conceptual point, a clarification question, and one relating to empirical effects. So the clarification question comes from BT Sayers, who asks if you could just briefly explain whether you view the words race and ethnicity as addressing different concepts. And Geraldine Woolley is asking whether you have any evidence of a behavioral difference in engagement between embodied and non-embodied institutions, either at the institutional level or at the agential level. So the second question is quite complicated, but I hope it makes sense.
Yeah, could you just repeat that one, Alan, the second question?
The second question says, do you have any evidence of behavioral difference in engagement between institutions that are embodied and those that are not embodied, either engagement by the institution or at the agential level?
Okay, thank you. So in relation to the race and ethnicity question, these are not contexts that I have conducted any research in, so I wouldn't want to provide any kind of indication of how I would try to conceptualize those. The reason that I mentioned those was because I think that there is perhaps something interesting that we would like our paper to do around stimulating debate around embedded action for individuals who perhaps are living in contexts of marginalization, as we see the women, the feminist actors are in relation to page 3. So that's the reason I mention this, because I think that when you are embedded within these institutional contexts, it is often, the kind of experience of challenging these deeply entrenched institutional norms is extremely personal. So that would be my response to the first point. And in terms of behavioral difference around kind of non-embodied context, there has been literature that we've drawn around the institution work and emotion work context that has looked at institutions, as I mentioned in the talk, around kind of haute cuisine, individuals within professional identities, which we've kind of characterized slightly differently, because these individuals who are activating perhaps emotion work efforts are within a kind of professional category, or indeed individuals who are perhaps activists in relation to kind of values. Oftentimes these are perhaps institutions that individuals are embedded in out of choice, and our point is that there is very limited choice in the context of the gendered institution, because this is something within which, the norms within which you live in are very much all encompassing. So that's how I would try to distinguish the response to the second question. I haven't really related anything in terms of our findings to that kind of non-embodied context, as we've tried to bring out the bodied context, but there are certainly papers within our reference list, hopefully when our paper is out there and published, that might be helpful with that regard.
Okay,
let's try and get through two questions quickly. Rita, you do one.
Thank you, Sarah. We have a question here from Martina Fern. Martina is asking, often when we see movements split, forming new approaches or strategies to the same problem, and is that in a sense a desirable outcome? And if it's not, can a movement incorporate an anticipation of a split early on and find ways to prevent it?
Okay. I mean, it's interesting. I think that, our data was over a 6-year period, and in that time we saw a lot of change. A 6-year period in the grand scheme of a kind of movement, or indeed in terms of institutionalized sexism, is not such a long period of time. But indeed, during that time, movements have evolved. The movements evolved. The No More Page 3 campaign has evolved, and now the movement, having had some success in terms of challenging these entrenched gender norms with actually eradicating page 3 in its traditional format, the organisation is now focused on, you know, trying to challenge gender objectification within the movements, within the media more broadly. So what my point is that we saw a kind of development of the movement. So not necessarily a split within the movement, but we saw kind of how the movement evolved over time. But within that, there were these tensions. And I think that sometimes perhaps being able to understand how individuals need different forms of emotional energy replenishment in order to sustain activism can be helpful. So this is where I think our findings are quite useful in terms of, you know, when people perhaps feel burnout when they're campaigning, or perhaps feel like the context is overwhelming, to understand that for some people the group may provide the context needed to engage action and kind of continue and sustain activism is helpful, but for others a need to step away is important. So I hope that that clarifies. I wasn't quite sure about the nature of the word split there, you know, in terms of what the kind of question was trying to get at. But from my perspective, I'm understanding that as either movements kind of evolving or indeed tensions within the movement.
Okay, we have time for one more question. If I say it quickly and you respond rapidly.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
And I'm going to abuse my position. So I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Funke Michaels has typed in a couple of questions that relate to something I was worrying about before the seminar. So I was thinking about the role of rationality in mediating emotions. So there's work by people like Robert Solomon and Martha Nussbaum saying that emotions are rational, considered responses that help us to make sense of the world. And if that's the case, presumably affective embodiment must be preceded by some sort of sense-making process. And that sense-making process, I presume, is partly informed by cultural markers. And that's Funke's question, really. So how does the cultural backdrop affect effective embodiment? So, for example, she points out that in Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world, sometimes gender is further restricted by cultural stamps of approval on the way that people refer to and view female bodies. Does that sort of thing affect the way that effective embodiment works? Is it something we can only really understand in a broader cultural context in 4 minutes?
Okay, it's a great question and it's a big question. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, you know, the way that we understand emotions is that they are sociologically, you know, relationally defined. So almost that while we experience these emotions individually, you know, our experience of these emotions, you know, is kind of conditioned by the norms within which we live in society. And you know, we have looked at page 3 in the context of a kind of UK institution, and there are kind of norms, you know, that surround that. So I think that there's definitely room for understanding cultural nuance around, you know, the nature of effective embodiment, which is quite interesting, and something I think that we will consider a little more in terms of thinking about how you know, how we feel and act in relation to our kind of experiences of institutions. It is very much a factor of our kind of own subjective experience. So I guess my short answer to this question is I think it's a very important one. And in the kind of spirit of the socially constructed nature of the way we've tried to conceptualize emotions and indeed the body, you know, in the context of the gender institution, I think that the way that we can perhaps interpret effective embodiment is that it could be variously understood in a variety of different contexts. So I think that that's a very kind of shorthand answer to what is a really big and interesting question, and one I would be interested in kind of continuing the conversation around.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic, and I think you've given us a great deal to think about. Sadly, I promised at the beginning of this hour that we would finish at the end of the hour, and that means we're just about out of time. Thank you very much, Sarah, for a really engaging and enjoyable hour. If we didn't get your question in the Q&A box, we're sorry. Unfortunately, time's pressing. Just before we stop, let me conclude by advertising the next retro seminar, which will take place on the 5th of November. It's going to be given by Judith Schrempf-Sterling, who is an associate professor of responsible management at the Geneva School of Economics and Management. And she's going to be talking about structural injustices, social connection, and corporate political responsibility, the case of business and human trafficking. And that will obviously be a rather different seminar, but it also promises to be fascinating. So thank you once again, everyone, for coming, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks' time. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you so much.